And Jesus himself said that he did not come to do away with the law.
Take us out of this world if he does not want us to be contaminated by it.
This is the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast with your hosts, Michael Campbell and Greg Howell.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast. We have had a great summer with lots of different stuff going on. I know Michael's been traveling and
both
hitting all
have
points. Yeah. All the different camp meetings and a lot of good stuff. I've spent some much needed rest time up in the Pacific Northwest just in the last couple of weeks, doing some traveling and stuff. So, but we are not forgetting our faithful listeners on the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast. We have still got things to talk about. We have actually, it's been kind of fun because I've noticed, Michael, in your traveling and even in some of my traveling, people have started giving us stuff, or we found things, and I'm pretty sure those are going to come up as some episodes here in the next few
so too.
Months.
Some very nice surprises that I didn't even know were out there. So we have to tantalize our listeners, but we have a few things coming up around the corner.
Unknown ephemera. That is usually our goal in this kind of stuff. So. Anyway,
today we have a special guest, don't we?
Exactly. And that's what I'm kind of excited about. This is not an unknown person. This is Dr. Brian Strayer, who has written a fascinating book on one of the early Adventist pioneers who kind of gets mentioned at one point in early Adventist history, and then you don't hear about him again. They're one of those guys that kind of just shows up, makes his contribution, and then fades out. And what I'm excited about today is that Dr. Strayer has pulled back the curtain a little bit on this fellow and showed us how much more is really going on here with a brand new book that is out. So, Michael, you know Dr. Strayer a little bit better, and I figure I'll just let you introduce, but it's going to be a good one today.
Absolutely. So a special welcome to Brian Strayer as a guest for this episode. And where do I begin, right? So, but he's an old family friend, and we go back to when Heidi and I were in grad school, young grad students that we kind of adopted him, would come over to his house where to go listen to watch West Wing and enjoy some good Michigan apple cider in the evenings, and lots of fun times. The other thing is, I knew that Brian Strayer, having taught in the history and political science department for many years, he was, I guess you would say, he's a legend at Andrews in the undergrad program and teaching. And I knew that his class in Adventist history was just like, it was epic. It was one of those things. And I was in seminary, but I thought, maybe Brian might not mind if I would just kind of sit in his class and just watch a master teacher at work. And that was one of my great joys, is just to sit in his class and hear someone that loved both teaching and also who both loves Adventist history. So, and I think that's so. Welcome, Brian, and comes eminently qualified as a historian. His background also not only in Adventist history, teaching that, but many other topics. His dissertation was he specializes in French history, early modern history, and many other things. I mean, I could go on, but so Brian, welcome. Tell us a little bit about your interest in Adventist history. How did that get started for you?
Well, actually, it began while I was a teenager, Mike, because I grew up in upstate New York, at the Union Springs Academy there. And I think it was my junior year, we had a textbook called The Story of Our Church. And as I studied that textbook, I began to notice that many of the early pioneer places and people actually came from my area of upstate New York. And so that kind of planted a seed of interest for me. And then in 1974, after I had finished my master's degree in history at Andrews, Dr. Richard Swartz, at that time the chair of the department, asked me to be his research assistant for the textbook Light Bearers to the Remnant that he was preparing for college level denominational history. So even though my name is not anywhere in the book, I was the one that did the research, took the notes that he used to write that book.
A lot of the legwork we say that grad students do, right?
I did the grad, yes, I did.
Uncredited heroes of the books.
Yes. And today, of course, I live only 2 blocks from the Center for Adventist Research there at James White Library. So it's like living next to a gold mine for Adventist primary sources.
Absolutely. By the way, some of our listeners may be interested, and we may have some from New England or upstate New York. In addition to your other work, something very unique, I think very special, is you've written a history of Union Springs Academy. I think even an update to it, haven't you?
That is true. Yes, I just finished this summer the centennial history of Union Springs Academy, which covers it from 1921 to 2021, and that will be available at Alumni Weekend in the 3rd week of September of this year. It's a major work, 450 pages altogether.
Wow.
So when we're talking about Adventist historiography, there's a lot of different kinds. You have these broad surveys like the textbook that you helped Schwartz with. You have biographies. We're going to talk about your biography here in just a minute. But also this kind of, I guess you'd say like a local history kind of thing. And these are all very valid ways of doing history, right?
That's right. That's right. Very few people do institutional history, particularly academy history. To my knowledge, our Center for Adventist Research only has about 6 academy histories, including.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a rare one to pull out. That's great.
Yeah, including one centennial history, and that is Indiana Academy here in the Lake Union. So not many people do that kind of history. It's a labor of love.
Yeah, kind of thing where, I mean, you can see that personal connection, you having gone there as a student years ago, and then bringing that back is it's really a gift. That's a gift to that institution. That's very special. Well, let's get into the biography for today that we're here to talk about. Just became available. I know that you've been working on it, so I had a sneak peek of it some time ago. And I know when I read it at that point, thoroughly enjoyed just having my eyes opened when someone can go in depth. But start us out by telling us, for someone that's listening and maybe is not as familiar with Adventist history, maybe they've heard of Hiram Edson before, maybe they haven't. But why should Adventists today care about Hiram Edson?
Well, as you mentioned, he typically comes in 1844 and then fades from view shortly thereafter. But in reality, Hiram Edson was a key player in the transitional period from the Millerite movement of 1844 to the formation of the General Conference in 1863. His peak contributory era, I would say, is the 1850s. And so I would say that we need to focus on him outside of 1844 because he did so much for the early Sabbath-keeping Adventist church. Secondly, I would say that because he and O.R.L. Crozier as well helped to solidify our beliefs in the Seventh-day Sabbath and in the sanctuary message, he is important, particularly in the 1844 to 46 era. Another good reason is because he himself was a deacon, a licensed minister, and later in the 1870s, an ordained minister. And as such, he helped to establish some of our earliest Adventist congregations in New York and Pennsylvania, which in the early years were tied together as one conference in the 1860s to 1890s. So he's a key organizer. I think another good reason, as I bring out in chapter 7, Ministerial Partners of my book, James and Ellen White handpicked Hiram Edson as what we might call a ministerial trainer. He trained Jan Andrews in his 20s. He trained Jan Luppro when Luppro was in his 20s. And he worked alongside some of the senior evangelists as well, Joseph Bates, John Byington. So he's a collaborative, cooperative, teaching minister figure here. And I think, fifthly, because Edson is unique in many ways. He's a numerologist. He loves numbers, particularly if they have some prophetic significance for him. Yeah. He's a symbologist. He seems to be able to find symbols behind every Old Testament bush, so to speak. He's charismatic. Now, there's something we don't usually associate with a sheep farmer, but Hiram Edson, as we will develop in our discussion, I'm sure, had what he called presentments, and he believed that these were divine insights that would help him understand events that were soon to come to pass. And then on the negative side, toward the end of his life, I would simply define him as somewhat of a curmudgeon. He's a little hard to get along with. He stops going to church for a while. He is out of favor with some of the leading church brethren. And toward the end of his life, he's kind of under a cloud.
Yeah.
But we need to understand that part of his life as well.
Well, this is very interesting. I want to unpack a couple of those things really quick. I mean, I'm sure we'll come back to some of these others later too, but first of all, I mean, I think it's very interesting. He was kind of a mentoring pastor, in that earlier time when we didn't have a formal system of theological education, but that mentoring, I think, really meant a lot. Not everybody had that gift.
Right.
So that's most intriguing. And the other thing I think is interesting is that, you use the word curmudgeon. I don't like that to kind of describe him at the end, but we tend to always focus on the history that is the warm fuzzies, Brian, right? I mean, the feel-good history. And I'm glad you have that in this book. I mean, he made a significant contribution with his understanding of the sanctuary, but he did have some very strange ideas towards the end and fell out of favor, like you said. So, I mean, that's part of the challenge of history, is not only telling the niceties, but sometimes maybe the foibles, the flaws. And that to me gives a sense of authenticity as I read your biography.
Well, thank you. I think that many of our pioneers were crusty old saints. Their hearts may have been in the right place, but their personalities and characters and temperaments sometimes clash.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is part of doing history, right? So is we don't and I think good history, at least, not any history is perfect, but an attempt to try to be as objective as possible. So so you mentioned a couple of things, but when you're working on a biography, there's the things you already know. When I read your biography, the thing I already knew about Hiram Edson is the sanctuary thing, right? This is what he's famous for. But then you also discover these other things you didn't expect to find, the curmudgeon part or whatever. Tell us some more of the things that surprised you and as you're doing the research. I don't want you to give your whole biography away, but tell us a few teasers here.
Well, I tell you, it's one of the things I enjoy most about research is the surprises. You just never know, when you pick up the next source, the next letter, the next diary, what you're going to find. And some of these finds are truly delightful and serendipitous. I discovered, for example, in doing my geographical research, that Hiram Edson lived 4 miles from the home of Joseph Smith. Yep. They were neighbors. And here are 2 men having supernatural experiences with beings they claim to be angels. Now, Hiram Edson doesn't name the angel that he met in his barn, but of course, Smith does. He calls them Moroni. So here are 2 men almost within shouting distance of each other in upstate New York. I discovered that Edson wrote numerous articles and a couple of tracts on prophetic symbols and timelines, but to my surprise, not a single article or pamphlet focusing on the meaning of the heavenly sanctuary.
Now that is really shocking.
That's
shocking, Brian.
Because we give him that credit. But it really belongs to O.R.L. Crozier, his contemporary.
Yeah.
I also discovered that Hiram Edson, like my earlier New York biography friend, John Byington, was a Methodist, an abolitionist, and an anti-Mason. So those 3 streams come together in Edson and John Byington.
unpack that for just a second, because the Methodists, that's pretty easy. We get
Sure.
that. The abolitionists against slavery, we're starting to have that a little clearer lens thanks to some people like Kevin Burton and others who are doing research on, how incredibly active our early pioneers were as abolitionists in the abolitionist movement and so on. So that actually doesn't surprise me even before I read your biography. And then what might be a little less familiar for people is the whole anti-Mason thing. Brian, can you just give us the Cliff Notes, unpack that for a second?
Okay, in the 1820s, there was a political movement that arose called the anti-Masonic movement. It was particularly strong in upstate New York, the burned over district. It stems from an incident in which a man named Henry Morgan, an ex-Mason, threatened to divulge the secrets of the Masonic group, society, and they allegedly captured him and drowned him in the Niagara Falls area. And from that reaction to that violent movement, the anti-Masonic movement arose, and it lasted for about 20 years, 1820s, 1830s, into the early 1840s. There was an anti-Masonic party that fielded local and state candidates. John Byington was strongly anti-Mason. Hiram Edson, strongly anti-Mason. And I think that filtered into our early denominational gene pool, that we do not favor secret societies. And I think
that's part of that larger milieu of that context. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell us some more.
Well, I also discovered that Hiram Edson was present for at least 4 of Ellen White's visions. He took notes on those visions, and he shared those notes with Ellen White, and she used those notes to refresh her memory about those 4 visions, which took place in various places throughout New England. I discovered, and I don't know the reasons for all of this, but I discovered that some of Hiram and Esther's children became Seventh-day Adventist and married Adventist spouses, while others of their children did not. And that, of course, was the case with John Byington as well. You win some, you lose some along the way. And then, of course, as we mentioned already, discovering that Edson was considered a curmudgeon in the 1870s.
Such a great word.
There were those who actually questioned his orthodoxy and his orthopraxy toward the end of his life, even though he was an ordained minister. He did for a while stop attending church, although he never opposed the Adventist church or its teachings. And so in my final chapter about Edson's legacy, chapter 12, I explore how Edson fell out of favor and how he today is back in favor. And I would say the main reason is Arthur W. Spalding. What Spalding does in his books is basically rehabilitate Hiram Edson's curmudgeonly reputation. He downplays the negative and he upbuilds Edson's positive contributions.
Interesting. So I kind of wonder, you're making me think, as you're mentioning that the 1920s and 30s, he would have been we might say a forgotten pioneer, but if I'm hearing you right, Spalding is rehabilitating his story within the broader Adventist historiography. I also wonder if, people that were challenging the sanctuary doctrine, I'm thinking all the way into the 60s and 70s, that's about the time, through the early 80s when the church really is developing a whole bunch of apologetics back against Desmond Ford and Adventist historic properties. That's when they buy this property. So, it makes me wonder, part of our historiography is also autobiography, right? It's part of, I find that intriguing.
I think the two go together. I mean, the purchase of the Hiram Edson site in 1982, the year, not only helps to rehabilitate Hiram Edson's reputation, but also helps to focus attention on the sanctuary message on that location. Yeah.
So, all right, I want to get into this whole vision thing with angels. Edson doesn't mention the name of the angel, but this has actually been the focus of some scholarly debate. Was it a vision? Wasn't a vision? Was it what was this? And so now you've looked at all these sources and then the historiography of it later on. Give us some clarity on this.
Well, I tell you, I do try to avoid the word vision, simply because Hiram himself never referred to his Cornfield experience as a vision.
Right.
I also don't believe that Hiram was a visionary in the traditional sense of the word.
Like Ellen White.
I do believe he was charismatic.
Okay.
That's the term I prefer to use.
Mm-hmm.
Hiram had a special word that he used for these experiences, and I do detail 4 of them in my book. He called them presentments. Now, I had not heard that word before. I was familiar with the word presentiment with the letter I in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
It's a negative, threatening, foreboding kind of experience. If you have a presentiment that something's going to happen, it's usually bad. But Hiram Edson used the word presentment without the I in the middle, meaning a vivid portrayal of some future event which he expected would soon be fulfilled. So I believe that what happened to him in the cornfield, he would not identify as a vision, but as a presentment. You have to remember, he wrote a pamphlet in 1845 predicting Christ's soon return in May of 1845. So to him, whatever he saw in the cornfield, October 23, 1844, would have been a presentment of something he expected to see happen within the next few months. Therefore, short term for him. So I wouldn't call him a visionary. I don't believe he was a prophet. And as we mentioned already, he does not spend a lot of time explicating the heavenly sanctuary services. That was primarily left up to others. In chapter 9 in my book, I mentioned the key individuals of the 1850s who explicate the heavenly sanctuary and its services, cleansing, investigative judgment, and so forth, are O.R.L. Crozier, Edson's companion, White, J.N. Andrews, Uriah Smith, Charles Sperry, and Elon Everts. So Hiram Edson really, is not focusing on the heavenly sanctuary. All that he claims to have understood after October 23, 1844 was, number one, the sanctuary is in heaven, not on this earth. Number two, there are 2 parts to the sanctuary, the holy place and the most holy place. Number 3, he saw Christ entering the second place, the most holy place, October 22, 1844. He did not know a whole lot more than that after October 22. He and Crozier and Hahn had to study it out for a good many months before they came to any further understanding.
Well, very interesting. I mean, again, it shows you, I think, the complexity of somebody like him, right? And and everything else. So, and by the way, you mentioned charismatic, not only thinking in terms of a presentment, but also in terms of some of his worship, and if Hiram Edson came to church, I suspect there might be a lot of Adventists today that might be just a little bit uncomfortable. Brian, what do you think?
I think Hiram Edson was cut out of the same mold as Ellen White when it comes to his Methodism. I think Hiram could be described as a shouting Methodist.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. Was he a shouting Methodist? Okay.
Yeah, I've never seen that word applied to him. But the charismatic meetings that Hiram and Esther held in their home were very much, I think, what we today would consider to be much more emotional, much more charismatic.
Yeah. I always like the word ecstatic as
Yes.
a way to describe it, because
Yes.
there is a later actual charismatic movement, or the early 20th century, and sometimes people might get confused with that, but that's to say that they're very dynamic and very being prostrate on the floor and enthusiastic, maybe waving hands and being slain in the spirit and things like that, as I understand. Is that right, Brian?
I would agree. I think Hiram Edson and Esther, particularly in their what we would call cottage meetings, their own home meetings, it was very rousing. We know that some of his neighbors sat on the hillsides around their home to listen to them sing. So it was very rousing music that they sang. We know that it aroused opposition in my book, as you know.
Yeah.
With some pretty nasty incidents in which people physically attacked Hiram Edson and his meetings. Yes.
They could generate strong responses, evocative. Yeah. So tell us about him as a person. What was, his actual life, some highlights that, again, for those that might not be as familiar with his story, tell us that kind of, who was he as a human being, right?
Well, I would certainly use the word courageous,
Okay.
referring again to the incident I just alluded to a moment ago. There were about 40 men who stormed into his home during one of these meetings, intending to lynch any of the Millerite Adventists they could get their hands on. And Hiram Edson confronted them alone, personally. He quoted a couple of Old Testament scriptures, and he calmed them down, and he moved them out the front door. That certainly took courage, to confront an angry mob of, he says, about 40 men. And that happened, I think it was December of 1844. Another word I would use for him is collegial. Once again, he was chosen by James and Ellen White as a trainee of younger ministers, such as Lepro and Andrews, but he was also very collegial to work with the older ministers like Bates and Byington in extending the boundaries of Adventism. So he's a collegial individual. As our comments, yours and mine, have already indicated, I would also describe him as complicated. He definitely was not a simple sheep farmer.
Right.
Although that's how he would describe himself in the federal censuses that I've looked at. He became a charismatic. He had presentments. He was a deep-thinking symbologist who loved to parse the Old Testament for any contemporary applications of any symbol he could squeeze out of the Old Testament. A numerologist. He covered the traditional timelines, the 70 weeks, 1,260 days, 2,300 days, but then he loved to go deeper into the 1,290-day prophecy, the 1,335-day prophecy, and then one of his favorites, the 2,520-day prophecy, which he actually squeezed out 7 different articles on in the Advent Review. So he's a complicated man. And finally, another C word, curmudgeon here. I think his heart's in the right place throughout his life, but he was a crusty old saint in the 1870s. He quit going to church for a while. He actually wrote a 200-page manuscript, handwritten, on the role of England in end-time prophecy, which he took from a very obscure text in Jeremiah about a lion, and he took the lion to be the symbol of Great Britain. The Review and Herald Reading Committee refused to publish it. You publish all of it or publish none of it. And Hiram Edson even mentioned that manuscript in his final will and testament, 1882. So very end of his life, he's still holding on, hoping that his wife Esther will get that published.
He's got a special light that he wants to share.
Yes, that's
And
how
they're
he
like,
that-
dear brother Edson, we love you, but maybe not this special light.
It's funny you mention him, because Bates was doing the same kind of stuff around the 1850s.
Yes.
And I always find that kind of interesting. He's looking at the 7 spots of blood in Leviticus.
Yes.
Here's Hiram over here, calculating out the 2520. I did some work at Center for Adventist Research on Bates's Bible. He was doing all the same math
Yes.
in the back of the Bible. A lot of these numbers are all the same kind of thing. Do you think there's a lot of crossover between those two guys, since they're kind of two old stalwarts?
Absolutely, 100%. In fact, in my chapter on speculative theologian, chapter 8, I draw parallels between Miller, Litch, Fitch, Himes, and Bates on the one hand, and Edson on the other. Edson is mirroring their techniques, their methodology, their choice of time prophecies, their symbolism. Yeah, Edson is, and he's very close to Joseph Bates, Edson is. I mean, they took long treks together, hundreds of miles together. So yes, I believe Bates has a very strong influence on Hiram Edson in this manner.
Yeah, because as I was reading your article in Spectrum on it, the prophecies specifically that he was looking at mirror a lot of the private studies that Bates was publishing in, the sanctuary symbols and his own pamphlets at the same time frame. So that's an interesting connection there.
Yep, I agree.
Was he going into a lot of the unusual symbols like in Ezekiel, Brian? I can't remember. You have to, but I've been rereading through Miller, and he really goes into Ezekiel a lot.
Yes, that's why I say Hiram Edson can find symbols behind every Bible bush. He can explicate some symbols that you and I would never even think of. He reminds me very much. Another one of my books is a biography of Claude Brousson, a 17th century Huguenot pastor. And Claude Brousson loved doing that. It was like a game, to find symbols in the Old Testament and then explicate parallels to the current situation of the Huguenots in 17th century France. Well, Hiram Edson's doing exactly the same thing. He's taking Old Testament symbols and then he's paralleling them with current problems and challenges in the Millerite and Sabbatarian Adventist experience.
Yeah.
Well, I would honestly say we're perhaps following that tradition even today in quite a few of our churches.
Yeah.
Yeah, this plays into your work on the history of hermeneutics, Greg.
Yeah, exactly. Because I'm watching the same traditions as they just kind of morph between cultural events and world issues. We're all kind of looking at the newspapers and our Bible in the same hand half the time.
There you go. Yep.
Yeah, interesting. Well, Brian, you've mentioned Esther a couple times now, I think, and I mean he's got a context too with his family, his parents and children. Tell us more about them.
Well, I think it's worth noting, and I do note this in my biography, that Hiram Edson was descended from 3 of the signers of the Mayflower Compact in 1620, and 5 of his great uncles fought in the American Revolution. So given this distinguished bloodline, he was actually qualified to join the General Society of Mayflower Descendants. But that wasn't formed until 1897, 15 years after he died. And he was actually qualified to join the National Society of the Sons of the American Revolution. But that wasn't established till 1889, 7 years after he died. Hiram's father, Luther Edson, was a soldier in the War of 1812. And so he comes from a very distinguished, patriotic, military line of service. In 1830, at the age of 24, Hiram married Effa Chrysler in a Methodist ceremony, and they had 3 children, George, Susan, and Belinda. But Effa died of unknown causes in 1839. She was only 28. So, like most men of that era, Hiram married within a few months because he had 3 young children that needed a mother. He married Esther Mariah Persons in another Methodist service. And they had 3 children, via Ophelia, whose correspondence we have some at least. But I say via Ophelia. The first via Ophelia died at 13 months. They had another daughter they also named via Ophelia, and that's the one whose correspondence we have in part. So they named the second daughter after the first, and then a third daughter, Lucy Jane. By the time Hiram Edson died in 1882, then he had enjoyed the company of 2 wives, 6 children, and 12 grandchildren, whose names are entered in his Bible, which today is in the Lowell University collection.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, it makes you kind of wonder. Go ahead, Greg.
Oh, no, keep on. Keep your thought.
No, I was just thinking, a young woman who dies, if she complications from a pregnancy or something like that, or tuberculosis. I mean, just disease was so rampant that really wasn't that unusual. But anyways, Greg, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering, Dr. Strayer, what with the Wesleyan charismatic stuff behind both Ellen as well as Edson here. How do you feel the church handled some of his charismatic stuff compared to hers in the later years? Because you did mention in the Spectrum article a healing that was mentioned, where he resisted the call of the Spirit to kind of go and heal this particular guy, but then, relented and had this amazing moment. How do you think the church has handled the early moments of that versus some of the later ones? Because I remember a fun quote from Ellen White in 1906, where she talked about how in the early days there was a lot more of these kind of charismatic events, but they couldn't really talk about it as much at that point in history. So I kind of wondered how much of that played into his curmudgeonly aspect later on in life, do you think?
Well, I think one of the metaphors that I develop for Hiram at the end of his life is a metaphor that he didn't really leave the church. I think the church left him. The church that Hiram was most familiar with was the movement of 1844 to 1860 or thereabouts. He was more comfortable, I think, in the developing movement with local congregations, with expanding frontiers, with exploring new theology. I think once we got our fundamental principles nailed down, what was it, 1872? Brian Smith kind of lists the fundamental principles of the church. After 1872, the church begins to take institutional shape. A lot of institutions are formed. We've got the conferences, the General Conference, and so forth. I think that Hiram Edson, like Samuel Adams, is not too comfortable at that point. John Adams goes on to be president of the United States, but his cousin, Sammy Adams, does not fill an institutional role. He's not comfortable. And I think Hiram Edson is a Sam Adams in the church. He's less comfortable with an organized, disciplined, institutionalized church with a fundamental belief system nailed down. He would rather write articles to the Review, exploring his symbols, exploring prophetic timelines, and get reactions from the beloved, from the believers,
Yeah.
But that's not what's happening in the 1870s and 80s anymore.
They're kind of battening down the theological hatches, right?
Yeah, he doesn't fit.
Yeah.
Including the one that Pandora's box he opened with the whole sanctuary, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think that helps make sense of her statement, because I always found that little interview she did in Oakwood talking about how we couldn't talk as much about those early ecstatic experiences these days. That helps make some sense of it, because his generation, and even in a way her generation, is developing past some of the open exploratory theology and experiences of that generation. They're moving past it, and yeah, that kind of helps make some sense of both him and her then.
Yes.
Yeah. Institutionalizing. Well, I want to come back to the book. Brian, tell us the story behind the book. Why this particular book? Tell us the story how this biography came about.
Well, as you earlier alluded to, there is a pattern in the biographies that I write. J.N. Loughborough came from Victor, New York, which is just a few miles south of Rochester.
Mm-hmm.
John Byington was from northern New York, St. Lawrence County, up near Canada. And Hiram Edson comes from the Erie Canal area, east of Rochester, just a few miles north of Waterloo, New York, where I was born and raised. So I'm doing the New York boys here. I have chosen 3 of our pioneers about whom we had no biographies. I feel a kinship as an upstate New York Yankee to them. Now, as far as Hiram's concerned, there had never been even a children's book on him.
It really is shocking, Brian, that,
it really
for
is.
someone, yeah.
It truly is. There had never even been a children's book on Hiram Edson. So there was a significant lacuna in Adventist scholarship on Hiram Edson there. And then third, as I go into greater detail on this in my preface, I think Arthur W. Spalding knew more than he said. When I read the correspondence, and we have his correspondence at the Center for Adventist Research, the letters that he wrote in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s to L.E. Froome and Thurber and Maxwell and Wilcox and other leading church figures, he knew more than he was able to say in his books.
Yeah.
You know, Review and Herald of that era, Pacific Press of that era, had kind of a self-imposed, well, I would use the word censorship. There were things that Spalding wanted to say that he knew he couldn't say. And one of his famous quotes was that the Adventist pioneers were more like horseflesh than angels.
Wow. I've not heard that one.
And he got an angry letter from Maxwell about that. Good old Uncle Arthur didn't like that phrase. So Spalding knew more than he was able to say. And that kind of spurred me on to say what Spalding couldn't say in this book. And then
looking for that horse flesh.
I want to give a shout out to a man that nobody knew, I suppose, outside of Rochester, New York. His name is Robert Allen. He died at 92 or 93. He was a civil engineer. He was a faithful member of the Rochester Bay Knoll Seventh-day Adventist Church, and he was a passionate collector of materials concerning Hiram Edson. A whole box full of materials regarding Hiram Edson's land purchases, his genealogy, any mention of him in local newspapers. I mean, this man collected for decades. And his son, Jim Allen, Academy student friend of mine, passed that box along to me. He told me when he did that, he said, Brian, I've tried to get rid of this box of materials on Hiram Edson for years. But every time I bring it up, he said, all I get is glassy stares. I said, you won't get a glassy stare from me. I said, I want every scrap in that box. And I have used every scrap in that box in my book. And that's why the dedication page simply states, dedicated to the memory of Robert H. Allen, 1923 to 2018. I was wrong. I see he was 95. Zealous amateur historian whose private collection of Edson materials filled many gaps in this biography. So that
Very
was
nice.
really the final spark.
Yeah. I remember meeting him at the Bain Old Church years ago. They did one of these sanctuary history celebrations, and they're at the Hiram Edson property, and what a passion he had for many years. So I think that's a shout out to people who have those burdens for collecting and have local collections of historical materials. And we may have some people listening saying, I've got a box up in the attic, and if you do, Indiana Jones, Greg Howell, and Michael Campbell will come and very happily let us know. We love to hear stories about materials that people may have just sitting around in a box like that, right, Brian?
Yes.
What's that, Greg?
We will drive to you. I will make the
drive to
move.
you, yeah. we want to see these things preserved in places like the Center for Adventist Research, where I happen to have a little personal bias in North American Division Archives, right? So, but I'm less concerned about where, and as long as these materials get preserved in some way, so that historians like Brian Strayer here have the ability to, have this can be the catalyst for a major new contribution to Adventist history.
Well, we professional historians most definitely appreciate the amateur collectors, the amateur.
Takes everybody working together, right?
Yeah.
We're never everywhere. I've just, even this summer, like we mentioned, 2 or 3 people have been sending me stuff, and they're clearing out houses, of older relatives that don't have any, they don't know what to do, but they notice, hey, this looks old. I'm getting stuff like that all the time. And it's those people who save it for us, because we can't get it all.
That's right. That's right. These great collections. By the way, I was at the Smithsonian earlier, and one of the reasons we have the collections at the Smithsonian, there's a thing, how do the collections of the Smithsonian exist? A lot of those collections are thanks to personal collectors who accumulate a significant collection and then bequeath that as a legacy for the people of the United States through the Smithsonian, and those special collections that people that have a passion for collecting or finding these things in many different ways, not just in Adventist history. That is how these legacies and how these things happen. So before we, I want to make sure we talk about how you can get a copy of your book, but and I think we've talked about this already. Curmudgeon, he's got some wacky ideas, his legacy, but I think maybe, this is a podcast on Adventist historiography, doing these deep dives in Adventist history. That's why we call it Adventist Pilgrimage, right? We're trying to really reflect in a deep way, but let's talk about the historiography about this for a minute. We've talked about Spalding, but the horse flesh and everything else, how we do history matters. And this week is kind of significant because, a famous Adventist historian who was very controversial, Ron Numbers, just passed away, right? So, this is, and I know our listeners are going to be, that it's polarizing even just to mention his name, because some are going to be like, he's a heretic. Other people are going to say, well, he was a saint, and probably there's a little bit of tension somewhere between those two extremes, right?
Right.
But how we do history, how we interpret it matters. So reflect it with us just a little bit more about the historiography interpretation of Edson before we wrap up.
One of the surprises I discovered that I had not known before is that from the time of Edson's death in 1882 until the 1940s, there is virtually no mention of Hiram Edson's name whatsoever in Adventist literature. Not in the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald, not in the Union papers, not in children's books about Adventist pioneers. He's virtually forgotten for 60 years. And then along comes Arthur W. Spalding, and in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, what he does is basically revive and rehabilitate Edson's reputation. His three key books are Footsteps of the Pioneers, that's 1907, Captains of the Host, that's 1949, and Origin and History of Seventh-day Adventists. That's a 4-volume set.
Right.
And Hiram Edson's name comes up frequently in volume 1, which was published in 1961. And so he devotes several paragraphs to detailing the early accomplishments of Hiram Edson in the 1840s and 50s, particularly. And finally, I would say that today, or at least since 1982, the Adventist Historic Properties Group, now known as Adventist Heritage Ministries, their efforts to establish a visitor center, to move the Luther Edson barn, to build a model of the earthly sanctuary, to establish the Bible Prophecy Trail and Garden on the site of Hiram and Esther Edson's former farm in Port Gibson, has immensely boosted Hiram Edson's reputation and focused attention on the sanctuary message as well. I end my last chapter in my book on Hiram Edson by asserting that if he could come alive today, Hiram Edson would be shocked at the positive, glowing reputation that he now has among conservative, traditional Adventists in the church. That was not the reputation he had when he died in 1882. Right. So it would be a big surprise to him to see how famous he is.
It's like a generation had to forget him to remember that he was a good guy.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
It's interesting with history. Some people, during their lifetime, they aren't famous, but then the story later grows, or that, as interest changes over time. And I think that's also very, very significant. And having worked a little bit at the Adventist Heritage Ministries in the past, I also know, like, for example, I think Joellen and Lewis Walton, he was a big time supporter, continues to be. They continue to be big time supporters, but I think that they were a catalyst for purchasing that property. And I also know that they were very concerned by the church with Des Ford and the sanctuary and everything else. So I do think these kinds of things that were shaping Adventism in the 70s and 80s, contributed again to this kind of starting to for people to care enough to actually purchase that property and tell that story, right? So
I agree. Yes, they were key individuals. Many of the articles that I've read are by those two individuals.
I also noticed Spalding, some of his papers and stuff. I mean, I haven't spent the time that you have, but he also had some personal relationship with one, not personal relationship in any other than just he knew and corresponded with at least one of Edson's, one of his daughters, I think, that helped supply him with material and information. And sometimes, just like this box was saved by Robert Allen, I wonder if also his having a connection and some historic materials and stories that were through the family that ended up, he had that, somehow had that connection, and maybe just like that was a catalyst for your book, maybe that was a catalyst for him to write about him, I wonder.
Yeah, Via Ophelia, back in
the second one,
it was about 1910, corresponded with him and shared some of that original manuscript. As I develop in my book, apparently most of those 200 pages were destroyed. Esther Edson allegedly burned them, but she saved about 12 pages, which was I would describe it as autobiographical material on Edson's experiences in 1843 and 44. And it's from that material that Arthur W. Spalding wrote an article in the Use Instructor in 1910. And later articles in the Adventist Review, and of course his books. So yeah, he did have direct contact with Via Ophelia.
Is that where that Hiram Edson manuscript that's kind of incomplete, did that come from her too, do you think?
Yes, it apparently came through her. Her mother passed it along when Esther died a few years after her husband. She passed that manuscript on to Viophilia, and Viophilia took it with her to Florida and then to Texas. It had a perambulatory route before it finally found its way, I think, through Froome back to Washington, D.C.
Okay.
In the 1950s. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I know Froome and Spalding were close friends, and Spalding was kind of Froome's mentor in many ways.
Yeah.
And so that's very interesting. There's always these connections and personal relationships. Well, before we're done, how does one get a copy of your book, Brian?
Well, thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. Actually, there are two ways. One way is to order it from the publisher, which is Oak and Acorn.
Okay. And they have a website and everything.
I would recommend contacting the director. That's a small press. There are only about 4 people working there. Alberto Valenzuela. So it's Alberto, Valenzuela at AdventistFaith.org.
So he's giving these away for free then?
That's what?
He's giving these away for free?
No, he's selling.
Okay. Oh, okay. I just want to make sure people know if they email him, they're not, don't expect a free copy. You gotta buy this.
The other way would be to order it from Amazon.
Okay.
I think they're selling it for about $12 plus postage and handling.
Now, I think they usually Oak and Acorn, not like instantly, but usually most of their books they put on Kindle after a short amount of time too.
Oh, okay.
So if you're listening to that, this is hot off the press. We're talking hot off the press. So if you're listening to this, that's what we love to do with Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast. If there's a major new book in Adventist history, we want you to hear about it first from Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast. But definitely check that out. And usually after a short amount of time, I think pretty much all the titles, imprints from Oak and Acorn, you can get them on digital form. So watch for that, listeners. You want to make sure, and if you want a print copy, absolutely, you can order that from Alberto at Oak and Acorn or Amazon. And then last but not least, Brian, what's next? I know Union Springs Academy, we talked about that at the beginning, but
yes.
When you get your wits about you.
When I get my wits about me, yes. Well, I've just finished 260 pages on Hiram Edson and 450 pages on Union Springs Academy. So at the age of 73, that's been quite a challenge. I have been told by 2 or 3 Adventist scholars that there is a need for a biography of Joseph Harvey Waggoner.
Now the question is, was he born in New York, Brian?
No. See, that puts him outside my New York circle. So I don't think about this one.
I don't know about this.
The outlier.
He does have some ministry connections in New York in the 1860s, and he is involved with the infamous Nathan Fuller scandal, writing against him. But he's Wisconsin, I think, for the most part. He's a Midwesterner. But as the father of Elliott J. Waggoner, we know a good deal about E.J. Waggoner of 1888 fame, but we don't have much at all on Joseph Harvey, his father, who was an editor, who was a missionary to Switzerland, who was a writer and publisher of pamphlets and books. So I don't know. I will ask my friend George Knight what he thinks about that.
Okay, because I'm not sure. I think you need a New Yorker. I was hoping you'd go for a woman like Sarah Lindsay, because there's still not a single biography in this series about a woman. And I think that's a travesty, Brian. And you've done so much work on Sarah Lindsay.
I have. I love her dearly. I have been to her territory. I've been to Ulysses, Pennsylvania. I've stood by her grave. I've seen her home in Wellsville, New York. I preached from a pulpit she preached from in Wellsville Adventist Church, the 1905. Yeah, I'm not sure we've got enough to scrape together. That would be the problem on Sarah Lindsay.
This is the challenge with doing history, isn't it? Sometimes
It
you
would be
wish
a
there was
challenge
more.
to these, I know of no diaries. If we just had some diaries, that would be great. I know of no diaries.
So maybe somebody listening will have a box in their attic, just like Robert Allen did, had this box, and has a box of diaries and letters, and it's just waiting. And that might be the catalyst, the tipping point to get Brian to write
There you go.
biography on Sarah Lindsay.
Yes, absolutely. Wonderful. I'm glad you put that out there.
She's out there somewhere. We'll find her.
All right. Well, I'm just saying, I've got to put a plug out there for women in Adventist history. Brian, you've always had a passion for helping to tell the stories of early Adventist women. Plus, we're trying to get a New Yorker there for you. So anyways.
Very good. Very good.
Anyways, hey, it's been a delight, a pleasure. Thank you, Brian, for joining us on the
Thanks so much,
Adventist
Dr.
Pilgrimage Podcast. It's truly a delight. Your book is a valuable resource. If you love Adventist history and you've enjoyed this conversation, encourage you to just purchase a copy, and this will be a valuable resource that will be a great addition to Adventist historiography. Brian, thanks so much again for joining us, for your valuable scholarly contributions. And without any further ado, thanks for joining us for another episode of Adventist Pilgrimage. Join us each month as we take a deep dive into our Adventist past.
And Jesus himself said that he did not come to do away with the law.
He will not take us out of this world if he does not want us to be contaminated by it.